The Paradox of Political Freedom Without Economic Sovereignty, a story of post-colonial Africa, the dream of independence. Welcome back, guys. Happy holidays to everyone. In today's edition of Teaching the Truth African History, we will uncover the true freedom that African countries did not get during the rush for independence in the 1900s. Well, let's get to it. In the mid-20th century, the winds of change swept across Africa. The continent, which had been under colonial rule for over a century, began to see a rise in nationalist movements. Across the vast landscape, from the savannas of West Africa to the jungles of Central Africa, the desire for freedom from European imperial powers was palpable. Countries in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa all erupted in calls for independence. The legacy of colonialism, however, was not just political subjugation, but economic domination. Even after the independence flags were raised and the European powers withdrew from governance, the colonial structures that controlled Africa's resources, trade routes, and economic systems remained in place. One of the most poignant examples of this continued economic control after political independence lies in the history of the CFA franc, Franc de la Communauté Financière Africaine, used in 14 countries in West and Central Africa. These nations were once part of the French colonial empire, and despite gaining political independence in the 1960s, they remained economically tethered to France. At independence, African leaders like Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire, Senghor of Senegal, and Keita of Mali, among others, were faced with the hard truth that breaking free from the political chains of colonialism did not equate to freedom in the economic sphere. These nations continued to use the CFA franc, a currency that was originally tied to the French franc. However, the arrangement was far from simple. In exchange for adopting the CFA franc, these countries had to abide by strict rules that ensured the continued dominance of French interests. France maintained the right to print the CFA franc in Paris and controlled its reserves. These African countries were required to keep 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in the Trésor public, French treasury, and in some cases had to get permission from France for certain foreign financial transactions. While they technically had a national currency, they were in practice economically dependent on France, with little room to maneuver in the global financial system. As years passed, the true nature of this independence became clearer. While political freedom was gained, these countries were still bound by economic rules that hindered real development. The French government maintained significant control over their economies, even though the African countries had their own governments and national institutions. The political freedom was a facade. Beneath it was a deeply embedded economic dependence. The paradox became evident in the form of widespread poverty and underdevelopment. Despite vast natural resources, such as oil in countries like Congo-Brazzaville, cocoa in Ivory Coast, gold in Mali, and cotton in Burkina Faso, these countries struggled to escape the cycle of poverty. The income from their resources, rather than being used to fuel domestic development, was often siphoned off to foreign corporations or used to repay external debts. The CFA franc system acted as a barrier to any independent monetary or fiscal policy. France's continued influence over the CFA franc countries was not limited to currency control. The France-Afrique network, a term used to describe the complex and opaque relationship between France and its former African colonies, ensured that French businesses and elites maintained a firm grip on Africa's resources. French companies often received favorable access to African markets, while France provided political and military support to keep regimes in power that were friendly to French interests. French military bases dotted the region, and French forces were often called upon to intervene in times of political instability, sometimes to prop up corrupt regimes or to safeguard French economic interests. In return, African leaders, many of whom were groomed by France, protected these interests, creating a vicious circle where economic freedom was continuously suppressed. By the 21st century, the failures of the old post-colonial order became undeniable. While political leaders in West African countries were free to hold elections, organize parliaments, and make laws, they remained, for the most part, unable to assert true economic independence. Many of these countries continued to rely heavily on foreign aid, and foreign investors, often French or European, controlled large sectors of their economies. A growing wave of disillusionment began to spread among the youth of these countries. The idea of political freedom was no longer enough. Pan-Africanist movements began to call for economic freedom. African intellectuals, economists, and activists began to argue that economic sovereignty was just as important as political independence. They demanded the ability to control their own currencies, manage their own resources, and create policies that prioritize the welfare of their own people, not just the interests of foreign powers. Lack of these lead to protests in countries like Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mali, where young people took to the streets to demand an end to the CFA franc and the reassertion of African economic autonomy. The calls for a new currency, one not linked to France, grew louder. Though many of these movements were met with resistance from both African leaders and their former colonial rulers, the debate about economic freedom became central to the post-independence narrative in Africa. The legacy of colonization, as manifest in the continued use of the CFA franc and economic control by former colonial powers, remains a contentious issue. The only way out is to adopt ECO as a proposed common currency of the Economic Community of West Africa states. All West Africa countries share the same passport, the ECOWAS passport. This passport enables goods and people to move freely between countries. Introduction of the ECO currency will gain African pathway to their financial freedom and enable African leaders to go toe-to-toe with foreign corporations. The next phase of Africa's independence movement is not just be about political liberation, but about the audacious goal of economic freedom. As the continent moves forward, the question remains, will Africa ever fully break free from the economic chains that continue to bind its nations? Check out my next video.